The last thing I saw before I ran was the beam of my flashlight catching a pair of boots standing at the top of the staircase. Just boots. Old leather work boots. They were planted perfectly still on the wooden steps above me, pointed directly down toward where I stood. And the strangest part, I never heard anyone climb the tower. Not a single step. I shut off my flashlight immediately and froze. The inside of the fire lookout tower was suddenly silent except for the wind pushing against the wooden structure. But those boots didn't move. They just stayed there, waiting, watching. That was the moment I realized something had been inside that tower long before I arrived. And it knew I was there. About 4 years ago, I used to spend a lot of weekends hiking in the mountains outside my town in Oregon. Nothing extreme, just quiet forest trails. I'm in my 50s now, so I enjoy places where there aren't many people. Peaceful places. Places where you can hear wind moving through trees and not traffic. One afternoon, I decided to take a trail I'd never tried before. It was an old ranger path that used to lead to a fire lookout tower built sometime in the 1940s. The tower had been abandoned for decades. I had read about it online in a hiking forum where people talked about forgotten trails and old structures hidden in the woods. Someone had mentioned the tower still existed. Just barely. That was enough to make me curious. I packed a flashlight, some water, and drove out there around noon. The trailhead was almost impossible to find. Just a dirt pull-off beside a forest road with a weathered wooden sign that had nearly rotted away. There were no other cars. That didn't surprise me. Most people prefer maintained trails. This one clearly wasn't. The path disappeared into thick trees and immediately started climbing uphill. Branches scraped my jacket as I pushed deeper into the woods. The forest out there is dense. Tall pine trees block most of the sunlight, and the ground is soft with decades of fallen needles. It's the kind of place where sound travels strangely. Every snap of a twig feels louder than it should. I hiked for about 40 minutes before I saw the tower. It appeared suddenly between the trees. Tall, crooked, and darker than the forest around it. The structure looked fragile, like it had been slowly collapsing for years. A wooden staircase spiraled around the outside, leading up to a small room at the top. The windows were broken. The whole place leaned slightly to one side, but it was still standing. That alone impressed me. I stood there for a moment just looking at it. There's something eerie about structures that people completely forget. Places that were once important, now just decaying in silence. I walked closer. The steps creaked as soon as I placed my foot on the first one. I tested a few boards carefully before starting up. The higher I climbed, the more the wind pushed against the tower. The entire structure swayed slightly. Not dangerously, but enough to remind me how old it was. When I reached the top platform, the door to the lookout room was hanging partially open. The inside smelled like dust and wet wood. I stepped in. The room was empty. Just a few broken cabinets and an old rusted stove sitting in the corner. Graffiti covered parts of the walls. Nothing unusual. I walked around slowly, shining my flashlight along the floor. Most of the windows were shattered, letting wind move through the room constantly. It made the place whistle softly. That sound echoed through the tower beneath me. After a few minutes, I stepped back outside onto the platform and looked out over the forest. The view was incredible. Miles of trees stretching in every direction. Felt peaceful, quiet, like the entire world had disappeared except for the wind. I probably stood there for 10 minutes just enjoying the silence. Then I heard something. A faint sound from below. Wood creaking. Not the random creaks the tower made from the wind. This was different. Rhythmic. Like weight shifting on the stairs. I leaned over the railing and pointed my flashlight down the spiral staircase. The beam cut through the darkness between the boards. But I didn't see anyone. Just empty steps leading all the way down to the forest floor. I waited, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was probably just the wind moving the structure again. Still, something about the sound bothered me. So I decided it was time to head back down. As soon as I stepped inside the lookout room again, I noticed something strange. The door I had left open was now closed. Not completely, just barely shut. I stood there staring at it. I clearly remembered leaving it open. The wind could have moved it. That's what I told myself. But when I pushed the door open again and stepped outside, I heard another creak from below. This time it was unmistakable. A footstep, somewhere on the stairs beneath me. I quickly leaned over the railing again. My flashlight beam swept downward along the wooden steps. Still nothing. No one there. But the forest below looked darker now. The sun was already beginning to drop behind the mountains. I suddenly felt very aware of how isolated that tower was. No cell service. No nearby trails. Just miles of forest. That's when I decided to start climbing down. Slowly, carefully. The stairs groaned under my weight as I descended. About halfway down the tower I heard another sound. Above me, a creak. Right above my head. I froze, then slowly turned my flashlight upward. That's when I saw the boots. Standing on the step above the landing. Just two boots. Motionless. The legs above them disappeared into darkness. My brain struggled to understand what I was seeing. Someone was standing there, but they hadn't made a sound. Not one. And they hadn't been there a moment ago. I raised my flashlight slightly higher. But before the beam could reach the figure, the boots moved. One slow step downward. The wood groaned under their weight. My heart slammed against my chest. I backed down 2 steps quickly. "Hello," I called out. No answer. Another step. Slow. Heavy. I couldn't see the person's face. The staircase above twisted into shadows. All I could see were those boots moving closer. Something about the way they walked felt wrong. Too slow. Too controlled. Like they were deliberately making sure I watched every step. I suddenly realized something terrifying. If they kept walking down, they would block my way to the ground. And the only other direction I could go was up. Back into the tower. So I ran. Up the stairs. 2 at a time. The wood cracked under my boots as I climbed back to the platform. Behind me I heard the footsteps speed up. No longer slow. Now running. I burst into the lookout room and slammed the door shut. Then shoved a broken chair against it. The footsteps reached the platform outside seconds later. Heavy breathing filled the silence beyond the door. Not words. Just breathing. Deep. Raspy. I stood there gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The door handle slowly turned. Once. Then stopped. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the breathing moved away. Across the wooden platform. And toward the stairs. I waited. Listening. The footsteps descended slowly. Down. 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 Eventually the tower went silent again. I stayed inside that room for almost 20 minutes before finally opening the door. The platform outside was empty. The staircase below was dark. I carefully climbed down. Every step felt like it would collapse. But I didn't see anyone. When I reached the ground, I ran straight back down the trail. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I drove home shaking. I never told anyone about what happened. Not until months later when curiosity finally got the better of me and I started searching online for information about that tower. I found an old newspaper archive from the 1980s. A short article about the tower being abandoned. Apparently a ranger had been stationed there for years. Until one day hikers reported hearing someone shouting from the tower. When authorities arrived, they found the ranger dead inside the lookout room. No signs of struggle. No cause of death. But the article mentioned something strange. Several hikers reported seeing someone standing on the stairs of the tower weeks after the ranger died. Watching them climb. Waiting above them. And that ranger had been buried wearing his work boots. The same kind of boots I saw on those stairs. I didn't realize someone else was inside the hospital until the elevator started moving on its own. The doors had been open the entire time I was exploring that floor. The building had no electricity. Every room was pitch black without my flashlight. The hospital had been abandoned for almost 15 years. But suddenly, in the silence of that empty building, I heard the mechanical groan of the elevator cables moving. The elevator began descending, and I knew I hadn't been alone in that hospital. This happened about 3 years ago when I was working a delivery job in Ohio. I was already in my early 50s, and most nights after work I liked to drive around rural areas outside the city. It helped me relax. Quiet roads, No traffic, just farmland and forests. One night I ended up on a back road I'd never seen before. It ran along the edge of a small town that looked like it had been shrinking for decades. Most of the storefronts were boarded up. The gas station was closed. Even the streetlights seemed dim. That's when I noticed the hospital. It stood at the edge of town behind a rusted metal fence. 5 stories tall. Dark windows. Parts of the roof had collapsed in places. A faded sign still hung near the entrance that read, Mercy Valley Medical Center. The place looked completely forgotten. Normally I would have just kept driving, but something about the building stuck with me. Maybe it was the size of it. Maybe it was the silence around it. I pulled my truck onto the gravel shoulder across the street and sat there for a minute just staring at it. Hospitals are strange places even when they're functioning. When they're abandoned, they feel worse. I eventually grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and walked toward the fence. The gate had long since been forced open. Someone had bent the metal enough to squeeze through. That should have been my first warning. Inside the property, weeds had grown through the cracked pavement of the parking lot. A few rusted cars still sat there, their windows smashed, tires gone. I walked toward the main entrance. The glass doors were shattered. The inside smelled like mold and dust. My flashlight beam stretched across the old lobby. A collapsed reception desk sat near the center of the room. Papers were scattered across the floor like someone had thrown them everywhere years ago. The silence inside the building felt heavy. Hospitals are normally full of sound. Machines, voices, footsteps. This place had none of that. Just the faint echo of my own movements. I walked slowly through the lobby and into a hallway lined with patient rooms. Most of the doors were hanging open. The beds were gone, but some equipment still remained. Metal 4 stands, broken wheelchairs, old cabinets. I checked a few rooms out of curiosity, shining my flashlight under the beds and into the closets. Nothing. The deeper I went into the building, the darker it felt. Eventually I reached the elevators. There were 3 of them side by side. 2 had their doors stuck open. The third one was closed. A metal sign above them read, Floors 1 to 5. Of course none of them should have been working. The power had clearly been cut years ago. I turned my flashlight toward the stairwell door nearby. That's when I heard something above me. A faint metallic clang, like something hitting a railing. It came from somewhere on the upper floors. I stood there listening. Nothing happened for a few seconds. Then I heard it again. Clang. This time followed by a dragging sound. My first thought was an animal. Maybe raccoons or stray dogs. But the sound felt heavier than that. I opened the stairwell door and stepped inside. The stairwell was even darker than the hallway. The concrete walls swallowed the light from my flashlight. Each step echoed loudly. The hospital had 5 floors, but I only planned to check the second or third. I climbed slowly. The air got colder the higher I went. When I reached the 3rd floor, I pushed open the stairwell door and stepped out into another long hallway. This floor looked worse than the others. Several doors were broken off their hinges. The ceiling tiles had collapsed in places. My flashlight beam swept across peeling paint and cracked linoleum. I walked down the hallway slowly. That's when I noticed something strange. One of the doors ahead of me was slowly swinging back and forth, like it had just been pushed. I stopped walking. There was no wind inside the building. The door creaked slightly as it moved. Back and forth, back and forth. I called out, "Hello!" My voice echoed down the hallway. No answer. I stepped closer to the door. The room inside was empty. Just an old examination table and a cabinet tipped over on its side. But the door kept moving. I shined my flashlight down the rest of the hallway. That's when I heard footsteps. Above me, 4th floor. Slow, heavy. Walking from one end of the building to the other. I froze. There was definitely someone upstairs. I stood there listening as the footsteps continued. Step, step, step. Then suddenly they stopped. The silence that followed felt worse than the noise. Because now whoever was upstairs knew someone else was in the building. I started backing toward the stairwell. Slowly, quietly. That's when I heard the elevator. A deep mechanical groan echoed through the building. I turned toward the hallway where the elevators were, and I saw something I still don't fully understand. The closed elevator door was now open. The inside was completely dark, and the elevator was moving. I could hear the cables pulling it downward. But there was no power in that building. That meant only one thing. Someone had been inside that elevator. Someone who had just gone down to the lobby. I ran. I rushed into the stairwell and started descending as fast as I could. My footsteps echoed through the concrete shaft. Halfway down, I heard something that made my stomach drop. Another door opened above me. The stairwell door from the 4th floor. Someone had started coming down. I didn't look back. I just ran faster. When I burst through the lobby doors, I sprinted across the parking lot toward the fence. The entire time I expected to hear footsteps behind me. But I didn't. When I finally reached my truck, I jumped inside and locked the doors. I sat there breathing hard, staring back at the hospital. One of the windows on the 4th floor had a faint light in it, like someone was standing there with a flashlight, watching me. I drove away and never went back. But about 6 months later, I saw something on the local news. Police had discovered a man living inside the hospital. He had been hiding there for years, sleeping in different rooms every night, avoiding anyone who entered the building. But what stuck with me was what the police said during the report. They had searched the entire building, every room, every hallway, every floor, except one place, the elevator shaft, because according to the officers, there was no elevator in that building anymore. It had been removed 10 years earlier. I only realized someone had been inside the church with us when the front doors slammed shut behind us. The sound echoed through the entire building like a gunshot. Colton and I both spun around instantly, our phone flashlights swinging wildly across the entrance. The doors were closed. Not slowly, not because of wind. They had slammed hard, and there was no wind inside that building. For a moment, neither of us said anything. We just stood there staring at the doors like idiots, waiting for them to move again. They didn't, but something inside the church shifted in the darkness. And that's when I heard breathing. Not ours, someone else's. Slow. Right behind the rows of pews. That was the moment I realized the church wasn't empty when we walked in. And whoever was inside had just locked us in with them. This happened about 6 years ago when I was still living in a small town in western Pennsylvania. I was in my late teens then, and my best friend Colton and I spent most evenings just driving around or walking the outskirts of town looking for something to do. Our town wasn't big, and after a while you end up knowing every road, every empty lot, every strange place that people talk about but rarely visit. One of those places was an old church sitting at the end of a dead road outside town. Everyone knew about it. It had been abandoned long before either of us were born. People said the last congregation left sometime in the late 1980s after the pastor died unexpectedly. After that, the building just sat there slowly falling apart. Kids at school told all kinds of stories about it. Some said they saw lights inside late at night. Some said someone lived there. Others claimed the place was haunted. Colton and I never believed any of that stuff. To us, it was just another abandoned building. But one night during winter break, we decided to finally check it out. It was already dark when we started walking down the old road that led to the church. The road itself looked like it hadn't been used in years. The asphalt was cracked and weeds had grown through most of it. Tall trees leaned over the road from both sides, blocking the moonlight. By the time we reached the end of the road, the church appeared between the trees like something out of an old photograph. It was bigger than I expected. A tall wooden building with a steep roof and a bell tower that leaned slightly to one side. Most of the windows were broken. Ivy had climbed up the walls and wrapped itself around the structure like it was trying to pull the building back into the forest. The fence around the property had collapsed in several places. We stepped through one of the openings and walked up toward the entrance. The closer we got, the quieter everything felt. Even the forest seemed silent. No wind, no insects, nothing. Colton grabbed the large wooden door and pulled. The hinges screamed loudly as the door opened. Our flashlights swept across the inside of the church. Rows of wooden pews filled the room. Dust covered everything. But strangely, the place didn't look as destroyed as we expected. There was no graffiti, no broken furniture. It looked almost untouched, like people had simply walked away and left everything exactly where it was. We stepped inside slowly. Our footsteps echoed loudly across the wooden floor. The ceiling above us was huge, stretching high into the darkness where the beams disappeared into shadows. At the far end of the church stood the old pulpit. Behind it hung a large wooden cross. I remember thinking how strange it felt standing there. Not scary exactly, just uncomfortable, like the building didn't want us there. We walked down the center aisle between the pews. Every step made the floor creak. Colton whispered, "This place is creepy." I nodded but kept moving. When we reached the front of the church, I turned around and shined my flashlight back toward the entrance. The doorway looked impossibly far away. The darkness near the doors swallowed most of the light. That's when we heard it. A single thud. Somewhere behind us. Both of us froze. The sound had come from the pews, like someone bumping into one of them. We turned our lights toward the rows. Nothing moved. No one was there. Colton whispered, "Did you hear that?" "Yeah." We waited. The silence returned. But it felt different now. Thicker. Like something had changed inside the building. Then we heard another sound. A slow scrape. Wood against wood. This time it came from the left side of the church. Our flashlights swung toward the pews again. One of the benches was slowly rocking. Just barely. Like someone had pushed it. But no one was sitting there. Colton muttered, "Okay. That's not normal." We started backing toward the entrance. Slowly. Neither of us wanted to turn our backs on the room. As we moved, the church stayed completely silent. Until we reached the center aisle again. That's when we heard footsteps. Walking down the aisle behind us. Heavy. Slow. We spun around. Our flashlights swept across the pulpit. Nothing. But the footsteps kept coming. Step. 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 They were moving between the pews. But we couldn't see anyone. Colton whispered, "Do you see that?" "See what?" He pointed toward the floor. The dust on the wooden boards. Footprints were appearing. One after another. Right in front of us. Like someone invisible was walking down the aisle toward the door. The footprints moved slowly. Calmly. Past us. Toward the entrance. Neither of us spoke. We just stood there watching the dust shift as the steps formed. Then the footprints stopped. Right at the doors. For a moment nothing happened. Then the handles turned. And the doors slammed shut. The entire building shook from the impact. Colton ran to the doors and tried pulling them open. They wouldn't move. Something on the outside was holding them closed. "Someone's out there," he shouted. That's when we heard breathing again. But this time it wasn't near the pews. It was above us. We both slowly raised our lights toward the balcony at the back of the church. At first we didn't see anything. Just the wooden railing. And darkness. Then a shape moved. A figure was standing there. Completely still. Watching us. The light from my phone barely reached its face. But I could see its eyes reflecting back at us. White. Unblinking. Then it stepped back into the darkness. The breathing stopped. And the church went completely silent again. Colton finally managed to force one of the doors open enough for us to squeeze through. We ran down the road without looking back. Neither of us spoke until we reached the main street. We never went back to that church again. But about a year later something strange happened. The town finally decided to demolish the building. The structure was too unstable and dangerous. When the demolition crew started clearing the inside of the church, they found something hidden behind the pulpit. A small trapdoor. It led down into a narrow underground room beneath the church. Inside the room they found old blankets, food wrappers, empty water bottles, and dozens of newspaper clippings about missing people from nearby towns. Whoever had been living under that church had been there for years. But what still bothers me is what the police said afterward. They found only one set of footprints inside the church that night. Mine and Colton's. No one else had entered or left the building.